Morning, Dan and Amy. So Michael Eric Dyson was on CNN this week a lot, the radical left blowhard that he is. Here's the position of the left as articulated, as well as it can be, I suppose, by Michael Eric Dyson with respect to Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Listen up, Michael Eric Dyson.
This man is lethally ignorant, incapable of even having a kindergarten's comprehension of the history of race. And for those who say, look, the Confederacy is about history and heritage, it is. The history and heritage of racism, the history and heritage of bigotry, building their sense of biological and, in many cases, theological and national identity upon a lie, a mythology of white supremacy, the belief that some people are inherently superior and some people are inherently inferior. For the president then to defend the actions against taking down Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, and remember, these people hated America enough to want to secede from it. The people that we claim, Black Lives Matter, the Antifa movement, and so on, are interested in preserving the fabric of America. Mr. Miller says, again, that there was violence there, but the problem is to equate the violence in reaction against bigotry with the bigotry itself is to misunderstand the fact that when you go to cancer treatment, the radiation is tough treatment, but it is meant to remove the cancer.
The key phrase there in all of that was Black Lives Matter and Antifa, or Antifa.
What do you say? Are you Antifa or Antifa? It's like Kofifi.
I'm an Antifa, but I'm sort of agnostic on it. If you want me to say Antifa, I will. It's up to you. If you think
Antifa sounds a little more street.
Yeah. Okay.
Antifa.
Well,
Jennifer.
Black Lives Matter
Jennifer.
and Antifa
Antifa.
are preserving the fabric of American society. They're what's holding us together. Is that right? For more on this topic, as well as a new Stanford University study on police bias that has not gotten a lot of attention but deserves some, we're pleased to be joined by War on Cops author Heather MacDonald. Heather, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
And again, we are not Claremont McKenna leftists, so we will let you speak. We just wanted to say that up front.
I'm not used to getting a sentence out. That can be a novel experience.
Well, what about that Black Lives Matter, particularly because that really brings in police, but even Antifa, they have had their clashes with police. They had clashes with Chicago police just the other day, this week. What about those organizations, if you will, as the leading preservationists of American fabric?
It's preposterous. As abhorrent as the white identity politics is, that is a reaction to black identity politics. You know, the idea that these left-wing groups are about unity and preservation is preposterous. They're putting out a nonstop stream of vitriol against American society, against the police, against white males generally, you know, which is just the constant subject of vituperation, of claiming of racism, bigotry, lethal racism, and you know they've had their own just appalling bouts of violence. Now again, the fact that somebody was killed at that Charlottesville rally cannot be dismissed by, well, they do it too. I mean, that was incredibly a threat to civilization. But again, there were 5 officers assassinated in Dallas in July of last year by an assassin inspired by Black Lives Matter, whose goal was to kill white people and white cops in particular. Later that month, another 3 cops assassinated in Baton Rouge. This year, just a month ago, a female officer in New York Police Department assassinated while sitting in her car in the Bronx, trying to keep that neighborhood safe. So that is an ideology that is, I would say, if you want to count the numbers, has produced in recent times much more violence and hatred than what Dyson would view as kind of mainstream America.
Just to follow up on that, because you mentioned the 5 police officers in Dallas who were assassinated, and that being at least in part, at minimum in part, a racial issue.
No, excuse me, it's 100% a racial issue.
Okay. The issue of the response to Charlottesville, heinous, indefensible as that murder was, is rallies, protests on the streets of Chicago, midnight vigils. The response to the murder of police officers, whether in Dallas or New York, as you mentioned, is police officers rallying around a fallen officer. I don't see organic rallies, protests of violence towards police popping up in major cities in America when something like what happened in Dallas or what happened in New York happens. What does that say about where we're at?
Well, that's a very chilling observation, Dan. And, there's not much you can say in response because it's so true. Obviously, the police have been demonized by not just the activists out there in the street shouting CPD, KKK, how many kids did you kill today?
Yeah.
The answer is almost invariably 0. I mean, last year you had 4,300 people shot in Chicago. If you believed that chant, if you believed President Obama, who says that black parents are right to fear that their kid could be killed by a cop every time the child goes out into the street. When did he say that? At the memorial service for the Dallas officers. If you believe that, you'd think, well, those cops in Chicago were shooting a lot of Chicagoans, pretty busy police force. In fact, last year, the Chicago cops shot 20 people, virtually all armed or dangerous. That's 0.5% of all those shooting victims in Chicago last year. But there's nevertheless this narrative that the police are engaged in lethal violence against black people. And so when they're shot, I don't know if it's just viewed as, well, job hazard or they've got it coming. I mean, you can find lots of messages on social media of gloating whenever there is a cop assassination, saying, celebrating the shooter. But to be honest, I'm sure there's people in the white supremacist group that are gloating about what happened in Charlottesville. I don't know that for a fact, but sure. I cannot rule it out.
Well, speaking of presidential behavior, I mean, you just spoke about President Obama. What about President Trump, refusing to call out the white nationalists who organized the event when he had an opportunity on Saturday? So if he doesn't denounce these groups, doesn't it embolden them or empower them in some way? I think he should have denounced them by name. On the other hand, I think he's made this much worse, and he's allowed the left to gain the upper hand, and don the mantle of virtue, which I think is unfortunate. On the other hand, there's a part of me that it's in somewhat of awe of his refusal to back down on saying that there was violence on both sides, not ultimately lethal violence on the part of the left, but he's absolutely right. That both sides, by eyewitness accounts from the New York Times no less, were equally at each other's throats, equally destroying our civil peace. And certainly in the last year, the violence, the Antifa violence, whether it's in Berkeley or Portland or Oakland, has been, it's exclusively an anti-Trump left-wing idea, where the idea is you can go up and sucker punch perceived Trump supporters. So on this point that there was violence on both sides, Trump is right, but it would have, I would have hoped, short-circuited this current media frenzy if he had named the white supremacists. But obviously Trump is not himself a bigot. I think he's just stubborn on some issues.
You had a recent piece in City Journal of Manhattan Institute, city-journal.org, Conjuring Disrespect, and you tackle a study that was produced by psychologists and linguists at Stanford University about police officers' conduct in Oakland, California. and a very good piece, very detailed. And it calls to mind the Star Chamber that was put together here in Chicago by our mayor, Tiny Dancer, to examine Chicago police and essentially bootstrap the Chicago police, nearly half of whom are black and Hispanic, are systemically racist, looking to treat minority families different than they treat white families. That was essentially the conclusion of the report that Emmanuel commissioned here, and it seems like you've got more academic work product that is pursuing that line of that line of argumentation as well. And this Stanford University study is such a case. You kind of dissect it and dissemble it. And I just wanted you to comment on what the Stanford researchers did, because you've got that Stanford imprimatur on it, and what it really means about police officers in Oakland, California.
Well, it has the Stanford imprimatur. It also has the imprimatur of the National Academy of Sciences, where this was published, and got widespread media coverage, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Science magazine. So this was viewed as sort of the gold standard for empirical research on the police. What they did was use transcripts of traffic stops from police officer body cameras to try and analyze verbal interactions between black and white drivers and the cops. And it was a done conclusion. I mean, it's a standard academic work product, which is the Academy today is committed to the idea of systemic police racism. And so they had their conclusion, and then they wanted to figure out a way to massage the data. The conclusion was going to be that officers treat black drivers less respectfully than whites. The actual signs of disrespect that the stuff they could get their hands on was absolutely trivial. If your readers can guess whether it's respectful to say in the middle of a phrase like let me see your driver's license, or that's you, that repeated phrase, one is respectful, one is disrespectful. Then they've got a career ahead of them in bias psychology. The most disrespectful phrase that the study researchers could come up with was Steve, first name. Can I see that driver's license again? It's showing suspended. That's you? That was the most disrespectful phrase they could come up with in their study. The second most disrespectful phrase was, all right, my man, do me a favor. Just keep your hands on the steering wheel real quick. That they view as a sign of disrespect. If these types of questions that are simply what officers say in the course of their duty are now viewed as disrespectful because they're asking a question, which was a no-no, they're using the phrase, please keep your hands on the wheel, which they say is on the disrespect scale very low. Well, guess why an officer may say that? Because the driver is out with a parole outstanding for a violent gun crime, or is not complying with the officer command. If those are now deemed out of bounds, policing is over. Nevertheless, this study has been spun as another mark against the police and has simply contributed to a phony anti-police narrative.
She is Heather MacDonald, contributing editor for the City Journal, where you can read her piece, Conjuring Disrespect, and you should. She's also the author, of course, of the bestseller, The War on Cops. Heather MacDonald, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan and Amy.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.